Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host, Jared Zimmerer, the Director of Outreach and Mission here at Word on Fire. And as always, a warm welcome to Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, it's good to be with you again.
Hey, Jared, always good to be with you. How are the kids doing?
They're doing great. Getting ready for Christmas and all the craziness that goes along with that, but everybody's doing really well. Little Anastasia's already 3 months old now. It seems like it's just flying by.
How about little Fulton? Is he starting to preach now?
He is. Yes, he preaches on all of the superheroes. So... So I know that one of the more concerning efforts or deals that you're going through right now there in Santa Barbara is the growth of the Thomas fire. Can you kind of fill us in a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's been awful. I'm sure as people around the country have been following, but we've been living out here with it. And it's all in my pastoral region. So my region is Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. And that's where the fire has been. Called Thomas because of Thomas Aquinas College. It started near there. And that's in my pastoral region. It burned its way all the way to the sea in the city of Ventura, which is one of the big cities in my region. Did terrible damage there. A lot of buildings lost and homes. It came within a few blocks of the famous mission founded by Junipero Serra. Then it started coming up the coast toward me, and it went to the city of Carpinteria, and it burned right down almost to the sea there. Then it kept coming, and it came kind of behind where I live. I live in Santa Barbara, which is right on the coast, and next to me is Montecito. It's a well-known little enclave, and the fire came right behind those two cities over the weekend. And Saturday was a terrible day. We had what they call these Santa Ana winds, which are very intense winds, and they kick up the fire and they sent it south, which means toward the cities. And so there was great concern. I had to evacuate the house on Saturday. I'm back now, and we're hoping that it's kind of under control. It's still around, and if the winds come back, we might have to leave again. So anyway, everyone listening, please keep praying. I think prayers had an effect. I really do on Saturday, because some have said now that if things were a little bit different, Santa Barbara and Montecito both would have burned to the ground because the fires were so intense and they were heading right toward us. So thank God for the firefighters who've been beyond heroic in this. But keep praying. It's been a pretty dicey time.
Absolutely. And is there anywhere you might suggest if somebody wants to offer some funds or some help in that sense? Is there maybe at the diocese website or?
Yeah, and go on our website, Word on Fire. We got some links, places you can donate. Because it is, as you can tell, I mean, it's costing a lot of money, but especially these poor firefighters who are just going around the clock. And there was a loss of life. One of the firefighters was killed on the other side of the fire. So the thing is so big that we're on the western end of it, but he was killed on the eastern end. So anyway, it's been a terrible time. So keep praying.
Absolutely. Be sure to keep St. Florian and St. Barbara in our intercessory asks. For today's episode, we're going to continue our discussion about the topics that are really near and dear to all of us at Word on Fire, which are the 8 principles on which we guide our mission as an apostolate. If you've read Bishop Barron's latest book, we're strategizing roughly how we can possibly create a movement, a Word on Fire movement. And these 8 principles are really the 8 aspects of our evangelical ethos. So they would be the guiding principles that people use in a way of life as well as in their spirituality. So we've already discussed 5 other principles, which are Christocentricity, evangelizing the culture, a commitment to the new media, and a reliance on the mystical body. And then our last episode was on affirmative orthodoxy. So today, Bishop Barron and I are going to discuss the 6th of the 8 principles, that being leading with beauty. So Bishop, maybe to start, what do we mean by leading with beauty? And in particular, maybe, the verbiage that the church uses is called the via pulchritudinis. Can you kind of fill us in on that?
Yeah, Pope Francis sort of revived that term in Evangelii Gaudium. It just means the way of beauty. The 3 great transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. That means wherever you find being, you're going to find these 3 things. So our great tradition has recognized them as extremely important. We have a lot to say in our tradition about the true. Think of the whole theological, philosophical tradition. A lot to say about the good. Think of our whole ethical tradition. But the 3rd transcendental is just as important. And I would argue now in the life of the church is maybe the most important. Wherever you find being, you find the splendid. You find the coming together of integritas, wholeness, consonantia, harmony, and claritas, radiance. Even the simplest thing, think of a scientist at the microscopic level, analyzing being. Wherever you find being, you're going to find beauty. And I think today, precisely because of our relativistic time, this is a very fruitful path because people get very defensive about truth and goodness. But the beautiful is less threatening because you just say, look, I'm not telling you what to think or how to behave. I'm just saying, look, it's an invitational move, and it's less threatening, more winsome. So that's why I recommend it, especially in our time, as a good approach.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Pope Francis sort of brought back the idea of the way of beauty, and the church really has had a long history of using the beauty of the arts and as kind of a pathway of evangelization and even catechesis. Yet there has been a current resurgence of asking Christians to somewhat rediscover this pathway. What might be some of the reasons for this reigniting of the path of beauty?
Well, yeah, as I say, I think it's evangelically fruitful path, and it's, as you say correctly, Jared, it's a very ancient path. It goes way back to the Bible itself. I think in the Hebrew scriptures, you've got the idea of kabod, which is usually rendered in the Greek as doxa, and doxa has many senses, but one of them is splendor or beauty, right? The beauty in the face of Christ. Think of the transfiguration, which was very important for the church fathers. Now come right up into the tradition, figures like St. Irenaeus, St. Augustine, very clearly, someone like St. Bonaventure in the Middle Ages, put a great stress on the beautiful. Think of the greatest poet, certainly in the Middle Ages, maybe of all time, namely Dante, who sees the beautiful, especially as reflected in the face of Beatrice, for example, as a route of access to God. And in the philosopher Plato, you see this great tradition as well, that you begin with a particular beautiful thing, and it leads you by a steady path toward the source of the beautiful. I've often argued that James Joyce in the 20th century, though in a very ambiguous relationship with the Catholic Church, kept a lot of this tradition in his own writing. He said his novels were reportings of epiphanies. So manifestations of the beautiful that lead ultimately, I think even in Joyce, lead ultimately to a consideration of the beauty of God. So, I mean, all of that is in the mix. It can be done, I think, at a very high level. So I've been now trading in some of these names from the great aesthetic tradition. But I think even the simplest person can respond to beauty at a level appropriate to him or her. So it's a very fruitful, universal, and winsome path.
And consistently when we think of beauty, we often think of the arts or, literature and film or music. But would you say that there are other forms through which evangelists might be able to take part in and share?
Yeah, I just mentioned the high and the low, if you want. There's, I think, if I can put it this way, a sort of noble Catholic kitsch tradition. You know what I'm saying? Is that there can be sort of kitschy, more popular devotional art. And I wouldn't just, look down my nose at that and say, oh, that's just low level. I mean, I think if that's done well in a way that grabs the attention of somebody, that can be a legitimate path. And there's something to me wonderful about how the Catholic Church has not turned its back on the kitschy level, even as it reverences Dante and Michelangelo and, all these high expressions. So I'm okay with that. And I'd also speak about the saints here, a beautiful life. So when you're pointing to a saint's life, you're not telling someone how to think or even yet how to behave. That's going to come, right? What you'll say is, look at Mother Teresa. Look at Francis of Assisi. Look at the gestures of Pope Francis. That's part of his genius, isn't it? And now I think, indeed, you will come to the conclusion, oh, I'd like to act that way too. Oh, that's something I could do. But that's a second move. The first move is showing. So the lives of the saints, and I get this from Hans Urs von Balthasar as well, that the saints are the greatest of the theologians.
Absolutely. And I particularly am a big fan of sharing the stories of the martyrs because I think a lot of people today struggle with the idea of a life of purpose. And when you see someone willing to give their life, as many of the martyrs did in these profoundly horrific ways, yet they held on to their faith throughout, there's something particularly evangelistic in that as well.
Absolutely. If you go to the venerable English College in Rome, it's this ancient college where English Catholic priests have been formed now for centuries. And you go in that chapel, and it's extraordinary to our eyes. There's all these depictions of the sufferings of the martyrs. So the young men who have been trained at that seminary during the Elizabethan period, when Catholics were under fierce persecution, they were trained there, and then they were sent into England as kind of undercover evangelical agents. Most of them were eventually captured and tortured to death. Well, in the chapel, they depict artistically the sufferings of the martyrs. And you're thinking, here's a young man now studying at that seminary, every day going to that chapel to pray. What's he looking at? But the sufferings of the martyrs. And yet they continued their studies, and they were sent to England knowing full well that was likely to happen to them. So to your point, I think the stories of the martyrs can have an extraordinary evangelical power. The very fact that you say that people were willing to give their lives for Christ makes Christ real in a way that he's not, maybe for most of us, but when you see what some were willing to do, you say, man, did they believe concretely in this person? So I think that's a very valid point.
I think it also speaks to somewhat the paradoxical nature of beauty, of how, we're sitting here, looking at images of people who were flayed alive and things, and yet we see a beauty in that strangeness. We just celebrated St. Lucy's feast day, and we always see her holding her own eyes, yet we look at it as this beautiful icon.
Yeah, and how strange the church has been in its willingness to do that. It often will show the martyrs, and Lucy's a good example there, with a kind of insouciance. She's carrying her eyes on a platter. Well, she's not recoiling in horror so much. She's kind of boldly showing, oh, look, even though they did this to me, I didn't lose my life in the richest sense. Or go to the wonderful Jesuit church on Farm Street in London, and you'll see a lovely, winsome depiction of St. Thomas More. And he's in the distinctive garb of the 16th century, but he's holding the axe which beheaded him in this very jaunty way. Like he's just kind of holding like a cane. And that's the idea, is that, oh yeah, I know you did this to me, but it didn't compromise my life at the deepest level. And that's a big part of the beauty of that statue.
Absolutely. And I know when we're talking about the way of beauty, one of your favorite examples of this concept comes from Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. Can you give a little explanation why Waugh's story is so poignant?
Yeah, in my judgment, the greatest Catholic novel of the 20th century. If you don't want to read the book, even though the book is splendid in every way, watch the magnificent PBS production of it that was done in the early 1980s. The very young Jeremy Irons is in it. But it's almost a word-for-word reproduction of the novel. So it's all the richness of it. What I see in Brideshead is this Balthasar rhythm. So I mentioned Urs von Balthasar, who said that we tend to go, or we should go today, from the beautiful to the good to the true. That's the way he set up his theological program. Well, start with the beautiful. Charles Ryder is the narrator of Brideshead. And he's like a lot of people today. He's sort of a cool agnostic, And what he's first attracted to is the beauty of Brideshead. So Charles is an artist. He's a painter. And his friend Sebastian brings him to his family home, Brideshead, which is this magnificent country manor, And Charles is enraptured by the beauty everywhere in the house. Well, Brideshead, so Christ is head of his bride, the church, says Paul. So Brideshead is a symbol in Waugh for the church, for Catholicism. What draws him in first is the beauty of the place. See? Then you see in the course of the novel is he's led slowly, painfully, but led to the moral demand of the house. Well, now your life and the life of your friend Sebastian too have to be brought into conformity with the beauty of Catholicism. And then finally, at the very end, Charles becomes a Catholic. He makes the intellectual move to embrace the faith. But it went from the beautiful to the good to the true. And I always think that's especially today, is a very useful and fruitful way to think about it.
It reminds me a lot of, just on a practical story, of Thomas Merton's own conversion, the beauty of Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember in the Seven Storey Mountain. So I put a great stress on that decisive reading of Etienne Gilson's book, The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, which awakened Merton's mind to the deep truth of Catholic philosophy. But you're right. Prior to that, the young Merton, he's only about 16, is traveling with his father throughout Europe. His father was a painter. And then when his dad got sick and died, the still very young Thomas Merton goes on a trip to Rome. And he begins to haunt these ancient churches. And at the time, he had no religious faith really at all. I mean, vaguely knew about Christianity, but had a sort of, modernist contempt or indifference to religion. But yet in these churches, he said he'd go in and pause. He wasn't really praying. He was just taking them in. But they had this mesmeric power over him. And that was the beginning, I think you're right, of the awakening that would be given very pointed expression by Etienne Gilson. Again, interesting, isn't it, how the transcendentals play out, the beautiful to the true, that depending on the person too, for me personally, it was the true. It was the breakthrough of Thomas Aquinas when I was a kid. I grew up at a time when beauty was not really emphasized that much in Catholicism. And the breakthrough for me came through the mind. Okay, that's me. But, everyone's different, and Merton had a particular path.
Yeah. Another example of beauty that you tend to point at is also individuals like Mother Teresa and people who are really a living example of the true and the good. What might you say to our listeners to encourage them to see, of course, their life as evangelistic, but then also having that good balance of sharing the good and the true?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the old cliche now, but it's true, is that your faith grows in the measure that you give it away. I think that's right. If you're feeling like, when my faith is getting weaker, well, give it away then. Share it. Talk about it. To be a Christian is to be a missionary, period. It's not an option. It's not a side task that a handful of people have. It's what every baptized Christian has, is that we are Christians in the measure that we share our faith. So what if you thought of your day that way? My whole day. And it's anybody. You're with your family, you're going off to work, you're at play, whatever it is. That an essential task I have today is to spread my Christian faith. Now, I know right away we have images of, the kind of browbeating, proselytizing. I don't mean that. And Pope Francis is right. He keeps saying, we don't proselytize. John Paul II said the church never imposes, the church proposes, right? But what if you said, okay, my day today, my job in all kinds of different ways is to propose my Christian faith. And it might be by the very integrity of the way I live. What do people see when they look at me? But it could be, too, the words that come out of my mouth. Do people hear the language of faith on my lips? What am I modeling, speaking, externalizing in the course of the day? Is it congruent with evangelization? Those are good questions.
Also, on a practical note, for those who want to evangelize, maybe they aren't artists themselves, or maybe their local parish isn't necessarily full of beautiful art or architecture. So where might we suggest they start with someone they're wanting to evangelize?
Start with films they might like or books they might like. So it's a friend of yours, let's say, he's a big fan of a certain type of film. I find a lot that you can find seeds of the gospel in those films. You and I both know this explosion of superhero films in the last, 10, 20 years. A lot of that, of course, is coming up out of this deep Christ image that's within our kind of collective unconscious as Westerners. Point to that. Maybe they're a big fan, as I am, of the Coen Brothers movies, which have all kinds of weird religious themes. Maybe they like literature. Point them to Flannery O'Connor. Find something that they like. Get into their world, and then you'll find seeds of the gospel there. The old Jesuit adage, that I'll go in your door, but you're going to come out my door, is I'll go in your door. I'll enter there, whatever you're interested in. I'll go in. I love that in the early Jesuit missionaries, people like Francis Xavier, is when he's in India, he dressed as a guru, which meant long hair and covered in dust and wearing rags. That's what holy people did. When he went to China, he put on the robes of an aristocrat, because that's what holy people were like in China. Okay, I'll go in your door, but you're coming out my door. Good. Find the way in. What's someone into? What do they like? You'll find seeds of the gospel there.
Would you also say that a person sharing their personal conversion story is also an example of leading with beauty?
Yeah. Yeah. And people love conversion stories. They always have, from Paul and Augustine up to Thomas Merton. They love conversion stories. So yeah, if you've come to Christ, tell people what happened. What was that like? Especially those who went from, let's say, a severe skepticism to faith. What happened? How did that take place? Yeah, that can be, I think, very compelling for people.
And then lastly, aside from Evelyn Waugh, what other examples might you give for people to learn more about this strategy, or more literature to read and kind of better form themselves in this idea?
Oh gosh, as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of Dante. It's the greatest poem in the West, and it's all about the Catholic faith. It's a wonderful thing to me. If you point to, as T.S. Eliot said, Western literature divides itself between Shakespeare and Dante, and there's no third. And Shakespeare, that'd be another show we do sometime, is, I think, richly Catholic. But Dante, this major work is all about the spiritual life and the Catholic faith. That's a wonderful thing to know. We tend to think, it's funny, we tend to think of it today as, if you're an artist type, well, you're going to be, skeptical, you're outside the classical traditions, and you're forging your own path. But it's not true in the Middle Ages. The highest artist of the time was deeply connected to the Catholic faith. So start with that. Flannery O'Connor, greatest Catholic fiction writer of the 20th century. I just saw this movie, the three billboards outside of Ebbing, Missouri. Have you heard about that? Quirky movie. It begins with one of the characters, feet up on the desk, and he's reading Flannery O'Connor. And the movie does have a very Flannery O'Connor feel to it. Read her. Study what she's done. Study how she evangelized through her literary art. Then, Tolkien and Lewis and all the usual suspects, I think, are good references here.
All right. Well, now it's time for our listener question. Remember, if you have a question for Bishop Barron, be sure to go to askbishopbarron.com and record your question from any device, and perhaps you'll be featured on one of our upcoming episodes. Today's question comes from Andy in Pennsylvania, who asks a question regarding faith.
Bishop Barron, I'm Andy from State College, Pennsylvania, and I've always been very impressed by the authority and the certitude of your talks that you've given, and very much appreciative of that. My question is, have you ever struggled yourself personally with your faith? And if so, what has been your approach to deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's searching at both, kind of personal and then more objective level. And the way you put it is actually quite right. That there's no contradiction really between the certitude you talk about and wrestling with faith. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Look, faith by its very nature, we walk by faith and not by sight, says Paul, right? Faith is not something we're in control of. It's not something that I got my eyes wide open, I'm walking confidently toward it. Take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. See, why do you take off your shoes? Well, because shoes mean you can just go. You got shoes on, you walk anywhere. You take your shoes off, you're not in control anymore. So that's just the nature of faith in some ways. You're dealing with the mystery of God, which is necessarily incomprehensible. Well, of course, then it's frustrating to our desire to see and know everything with great clarity, right? So in that sense, does everyone struggle with faith? Yeah, absolutely. Have I? Yeah, at different times. I think, too, does the faith, if I put it this way, ebb and flow a bit, where at times in your life, it is surging into your soul with tremendous power. Other times, is it ebbing a bit? Yeah, and now read John on the Cross. Read the great mystics as they talk about that. Does God himself sometimes take away from us this keen sense of certitude and confidence? Yeah, because we're not meant to trust in that. We're meant to trust in him, right? So we're getting into deep waters quickly, but your question is a very searching one. I'd say faith by its very nature, even as it's strong, it's powerful, it's expressed with a confidence. Even as all that's true, it remains always a walk in the dark. We walk by faith and not by sight. And so, yeah, I think everybody, even especially the great saints, I was going to say even the great saints, but especially the great saints. Read, for example, the little flower, the very end of her life as she's on her deathbed and is wrestling with faith. That's just par for the course.
All right. Well, thanks so much for tuning in to the Word on Fire show. Be sure to check out our website, www.wordonfireshow.com, for several links regarding the topic we discussed today. And can I ask you a favor? If you're enjoying the show, please go to the Word on Fire show podcast on iTunes, and if you could, please leave us a review. You know, the more reviews we get, and the more people we'll be able to reach and draw into this depth of the spiritual life. Thanks in advance, and God bless, and we'll see you back here next week on the Word on Fire show.